everybody. Welcome back to Psychedelics Today. This is Joe Moore doing a short intro for this Friday episode. So today on the show, we have a really interesting guest, and I'm going to let it be a surprise until we get in there. Just wanted to let y'all know one quick clarification we received from a listener. Last Friday's episode, we talked about the statistical analysis on some of the recent MAP studies, and a listener, thankfully, reached out and wanted to help us clarify something we said. So on the show, I think we said almost everybody who has been through the trial gains significant benefit. That's not at all what the statistical analysis said. Rather, it stated that there's a 90% chance that this trial will end up among the group of studies that support benefit greater than placebo. It does not predict that 90% of participants will have a positive response. It could be that only 50% have a positive response, but that still surpasses placebo with statistical probability of not being due to chance alone. So thank you, anonymous listener. Appreciate you pointing that out. And yeah, and the 90% number wasn't the 90% of patients no longer scored for PTSD after a year. That I think is like the best figure if you're talking to folks about it. And the figure is something more along the line of like 70 to 78%, I think, of patients in the phase 2. I don't really have any data on phase 3. So yeah, that's quick clarification on that point. Hope that was helpful, and sorry for the misinformation. And also we have Navigating Psychedelics for Clinicians and Therapists coming up in July. Starts July 9. It's at 5 noon my time and 5 my time. So that is 2 and 7 Eastern for 8 weeks. The courses are recorded. If you miss them, you can watch them again later. Not a big deal if you miss class. And do offer a certificate for completion of the course. And it's an 8-week live supported journey essentially through psychedelic history, harm reduction, getting ready for an experience, integration, all that kind of stuff. And we've got a substantial collection of masterclasses from people with experience in all different areas of psychedelia. So if you want to check that out, come over to psychedeliceducationcenter.com and learn more. If you have any questions, email us, psychedelicstodayemail@gmail.com. That's it for now. Enjoy this episode. All right, welcome back to Psychedelics Today, everybody. Today we're joined with Dave McGaughey. Is that how you pronounce your last name?
McGaughey, but I've heard everything from McGarry to spaghetti. So
Spaghetti. How do you get spaghetti out of that? Cool. We're excited to have you on to chat about a lot of things. Paula, NorthStar, and some of your work behind there. So yeah, we originally touched base, I think like 2 years ago at Horizons, and then met you again last year and then at Korea. So it's been fun kind of bumping into you here and there. And then you reached out just about the NorthStar Pledge. We recorded a little bit with Brett Green, and he just brought that up on one of our last episodes. And so we figured we'd get one of the founding members on from NorthStar to chat about it. So anything that you want to let the listeners know, a little bit about your background or anything that you want to share before we get going here?
Sure. First, to you both, thanks so much for having me on and taking the time. And I feel really grateful that we are here sharing a deep passion for these medicines and the ways that they've impacted our lives and other people's lives. And I also appreciate that we're here during a time of COVID, and like at times this conversation really feels like a luxury to me. And we've even on my team had our own destabilizing moments where we're like, does this matter really in the considerations of like the systemic inequality and suffering that's going on? And at the same time, I feel that like the need for psychedelics is more urgent than ever in the face of the trauma we're seeing here. And also like what this system is exposing, just the notion that we can have over 30 million people filing for unemployment in such a short period of time. And this idea of like making real the notion that 40% of Americans can't afford a $400 emergency expense. Like it's academic until like it happens, and it's incredibly destabilizing. And so anyway, I recognize that like the container in some ways for our conversation is that, and it's really hard. And so at the same time, like, I'm super grateful for the passion and commitment that we have and that this field has to see this healing get to the world and like matter in a really big way. And we have massive problems and we have a massive opportunity and of course a lot of responsibility with that too.
Yeah, definitely. So I guess let's kick it off and just dive right into Call It Paula. Can you give a little background about that piece? I know a lot of folks in the psychedelic community were sharing that. What was that? Last year it came out, got a lot of great attention, and it's a great little story, right? About somebody who's trying to get involved in psychedelics and then kind of seeing the evolution and then coming back and thinking about, were some of those actions maybe appropriate, or did I like the way that all unfolded? But yeah, could you give a little, I guess, synopsis of that story and maybe why you wanted to come up with that story?
Yeah, thanks so much for that question. And if I don't get to this, I'd also like to touch on why I published it anonymously, because that represents an evolution in thinking too. Yeah, so maybe I think it'd be helpful to do a little bit of my own background. So I'll do the very fast version, and if I see your eyes glaze over, I'll know that I'm taking too long. Yeah. Okay, so very quickly, I actually was passionate about kombucha growing up and ran my own small business in college, making and selling kombucha. That sort of like derailed my life as an environmental writer and activist. And I pursued learning business in order to make my own kombucha business. And flash forward 6 years of time working in the industrial or the natural food industry. And I found myself very far removed from the reasons that I got in there. And interestingly, natural food and psychedelics are both sort of twins of the counterculture. And I found myself in an industry that had gotten so far away from the land or from its roots that instead of making good for you products, the language was better for you. So like Pringles without the trans fats. And people were sort of like serving, if you think about it, the very, very incremental shift of the American diet. Like, let's not have any conversation about getting the consumer off the couch and maybe off the TV. Let's just put a healthier chip in their hands. So that's pretty disenfranchising to like recognize and sort of wake up to. And for me, the critical moment was on an escalator at a convention called Expo West. There's 100,000 people in Anaheim, and the convention hall is set up so that you rise this escalator kind of like, and the doors open at the top. And on the escalator between the two sides, in the place that didn't move, every 6 feet was an exit. A brand that sold that year and the price if it was disclosed. And so you go up this escalator and you just sort of feel your adrenal system react. And it's like this brand, 100 million, that brand, 400 million, this brand, 1.1 billion. And you kind of look around and there's honestly a gold rush energy there. And again, if you think about where natural food comes from and what the prayer of the movement of natural food was, it is so disassociated from that thing now. And I looked around it and I honestly saw like many people like me, so many young white men who had bought into the gold rush idea and had sort of come to make their millions. And it wasn't about healing and it wasn't about food. It was this, incremental, better for you chip as like a symbol for that phenomenon. Anyway, that like led to me asking my own critical reflections of like, what do we spend our short lives doing and why? And ultimately that caused me to leave natural food. I left because I read the book Island. Maybe another time we'll sync up and have a conversation about that book. It's the most important book I've ever read. It was its own psychedelic experience. And that was the first time that I had language for my own independent psychedelic experiences that framed them in a way of a societal use and ultimately a use that's built around like advancing in our own lives. So reading that book was very destabilizing and ultimately led me to leave. Flash forward to my first psychedelics conference, which was not long before we met, actually, Kyle, at Horizons, which was the Cultural Political Perspectives Conference put on by Bia and Chacruna. And that's right when the Compass Pathways controversy was boiling really intensely at that point in time. And it also coincided with the launch of the Open Science, Open Praxis statement. And I had two key takeaways there. One was I had never been in a room with more brilliant, compassionate people committed to seeing a better world. And it was really stark because it was such a contrast from the world of natural food I had known, which was functionally like still in an old boys club mentality. Like there was not compassion there. And I was basically, I became humbled by the genius around me there. And I said, I learned how much this community, and I meant community in the sense of like people in the room and the people in the ecosystem, how much I could learn from them. That was the first takeaway, and that was a really great one. The other one was that I wondered how prepared they were, even like on a felt level, for what a commercialized future could look like, thinking that since natural food and psychedelics are both twins of the counterculture, and they took very different paths, like those paths appear to be converging again. And I wanted to try and find a way to convey what that future could look like in a way that was not just academic. I wanted people to feel it. And I didn't know how to do that. And then I had a dream at some point that thought sort of like lingered for a long time. And at some point in the next year, I had a dream. And the dream was just the image of a girl standing in Times Square with psychedelic everything. I'm from New York City, so that's a familiar sight. And I also remember this scene in this movie about strip mining for coal, where like the families from rural West Virginia come to Times Square for the first time, and like they see the waste, and it's like visceral and horrible. And maybe that inspired this like vision. I just saw this girl looking at like a world which was like as far removed from the soul and intention of the community that I had come to know. And that became the basis point of what ultimately became, we'll call it Paula. And the learning as well was that at first it was very like apocalyptic. And I'm not saying it's not dystopic in the end, but it wasn't what it became. And what I learned was that it couldn't just be a word of warning. It had to be a love letter too. It had to like try and catch the tenor of like feeling of something palpable and really wonderful that's happening here. And also like the good heart that may go into it. And so I had to serve that to reach people to feel the other part. You sort of like feel what it could be or what you long for it to be, and you see what it becomes at that point. So anyway, that's like kind of the backstory. And the reason I was able to create it was because at the time I was actually working with a couple of groups in the field. I was working with Sage Integrative Health on their website and kind of like aesthetic and communication side, like helping the healers with the business side a little bit. And I was also working with Oren Fund, which is a really small donor advised fund. And that Kat Konauer, who's a colleague of mine now, was coming to my psychedelic community co-work I used to host at my old house and showed me a logo that was not entirely satisfactory that she had gotten from 99 Designs. And that started a conversation and it ended up making like the Oren Fund site come out of it. And so Kat gave me a super small stipend, but a very generous one, given that I had no track record of making something like this, to create that story. So forever, literally forever, for my entire life, I'll be indebted to her for that extraordinary act of generosity. And ultimately, more than even the resources, it was the accountability. Like, because that story took a lot. It took a lot out of me. It was a lot of shadow work. It was a lot of projecting like my own darkest sides and longings. And it meant many, many nights being awake very late. I also created it on a 2013 MacBook Air, which would give me like the click wheel of death at almost every like third stroke. So I made all the art on the trackpad of that computer, which is just extraordinary to think about now. But it was very tedious and very long and very wonderful. And there's no way I would have gone through any of that without the accountability piece. So super grateful to her. And then ultimately, it's funny, Kyle, because when we talked last, I saw the text I sent you, which was from Horizons of 19. And I had slept like 2 hours that night, published Paula at like 4 or 5 a.m. and then went to Horizons at like 8 a.m. and saw you. And I was like, hey, like I wrote this story and I don't know if anyone will care, but here it is. And so that was like the last communication we had. So anyway, that's a little bit of the background. And I don't know, I would love to hear your perspectives on the story and not just like what you liked, if there was things about it you liked, but also where it got wrong or like where it missed the mark as well.
Yeah, it's been a while since I read it, so I don't remember all the details around it. But I did kind of like the arc of somebody that, had this passion around psychedelics. They wanted to like, become a therapist in the field, correct? And then they had the clinic. Am I correct on that?
Pretty much, yeah. She wanted to scale the clinics, but she was not herself a clinician, yeah.
Right. Oh, okay. Right. She was helping that. And then just kind of like that reflection piece after of like, was that the right decision? Did we approach this in a responsible manner? And just, Yeah, I thought it had like a nice story arc like that. Because, I think it is important to kind of like project like some of our intentions of like going in there. We're all super passionate about this, right? And we want to see it grow in a healthy way. And I kind of just liked how you were pointing out with the natural food, right? It's like, it's not good for you, it's better for you. Kind of just noticing that difference, right? It's like, here's something that has a little bit of like, I guess you would say like soul or history to it, and then kind of, going to Times Square and just seeing it in your face and becomes really popular. And yeah, so I don't know. It was a really great story. And like I said, I'm sorry, I haven't read it in a while.
It's really hard to like argue your point, right? Like someone goes in with this solid intention. They want to really help people. And yeah, like often people get off the trail. Like, they're sniffing, following the trail of this thing, and they think they're getting close, and then they see that other thing over there to the left, which is what humans do, right? Like fat, sugar, salt. Like we go towards, security and comfort, and money screams security and comfort. So like, is that really true though? Not necessarily, but it's like it's part of our genetics is a number of desires, like protecting the ones around us. Money can theoretically do that too. Theoretically, no one's safe in the time of a revolution. So, money makes you a target in those cases. So beware, folks. But, yeah, like how do you, it's a nice cautionary tale. To be very honest, I was a little triggered by it because of us building this company. We've had integrity as our number one goal, like often through this whole process. So we've turned down investors. We've made bad partnerships and had to like put statements out about it. We've, tried to be super honest about all that stuff and honest with all of our listeners about our process. So, for me, the amount of hard work we put into this project, like it made me a little uncomfortable to go like, no, and now perhaps even more so now, I was laid off from my full-time job. I just wrapped up a 15-year career in software. And, thankfully, Kyle and I put in so much work over the course of nearly 4 years that it was not exactly a super scary landing, but it was still like tenuous. Like we're not comfortable. Like I don't have health insurance. Sorry. Like we're getting really scrappy and we still want to figure out how do we balance this building a business and helping people to the best of our ability with integrity and all that. So it's a really hard thing. And because I've invested, this is now my life's work is Psychedelics Today. So it's like, okay, like, are we screwing up? And perhaps that's the point is just reflect inward here and there. It doesn't need to be LSD. You can read an essay that makes you really, or an art piece like that. I don't really know how you want to frame it. Story, I guess. You can read a story to really be self-reflective too. And when I'm triggered, I'm like, okay, the greed's there. It's down there. Like it's hard to really escape Mordor. Once you touch the ring, it doesn't really ever leave you or put the ring on. It's always got a mark. And, so it's a balancing act. So I appreciated it. But at the same time, I felt, I guess threatened or whatever. But I'm sure a lot of people did because a lot of people want to have 100 sites for their ketamine business or whatever it is when perhaps you only need one and you share that with a few people. But it's, like, how do we reflect on what do we actually need and what are we actually trying to do? And I like to go back to Simon Sinek, like start with why and really like hold on to that. Like, what is your why? So, that's kind of my rant. So thanks for indulging me on that.
No, thanks for sharing. It's so fascinating because interestingly, like, I have a couple of reflections. So first, I actually think the character made a mistake early on, which is like the character had a really good idea, or I would say her heart was in the right place. But I would delineate that from an intention. Like, I think she didn't actually have an intention and she didn't have guides to put it in psychedelic language. Like, she didn't say the exact purpose of this thing is to accomplish this. And that means also knowing what the shadows of that are and saying the ways it could go wrong are these. And then building in the accountability check, which is where external people, mentors, guides, elders come in to say, I'm asking you to hold me accountable to my prayer of why I am doing this. And so she went in essentially not aware of how the organization would take on an ego of its own in a way, enacted its own self-preservation, and that it would be almost impossible to shape from that point. And that's really challenging. And that's not like a clear answer, but I do think she could have done more to predict, maybe not predict what could have gone wrong, but said, I'm going to like really hone in on the why, like you said, and I'm going to try and put people around me to hold me accountable to that thing. That's the first quick thought. The second one is that, interestingly, a lot of the people who reached out have been business people, and that wasn't the intended audience. I mean, I told you the story, right? Like in my mind, I was like, the community here, and I don't use that language a ton. I talk about either the anchoring community or I talk about the field if I can. But in this case, because like these are relationships that I have with human beings who I learn from tremendously and admire and have potentially even worked alongside and hope succeed, or they're sort of like the good guys in a way you want to see succeed because their heart is in the right place. And I wanted them to have more cognizance of what could happen. But to do that, I projected my own shadows into a story. And I think it's the shadows we all have about wanting power and voice and influence that reached people on the business side more. And so a lot of the feedback that came in were entrepreneurs and investors who said, this story really touched a chord and I don't want to repeat it. And so what can the learning be? And so I know we'll talk about NorthStar, but that's a strong place of where the motivation for that comes from is, for me, the learning that came from like my own, I'm not going to say vilification, but I certainly dehumanized the arriving business and finance like perspectives and kind of put, as a friend says, like I let the storefront seem like the human beings behind the register. And like, that's not really true. And we are human beings. And so it was the resonance of the story with business people that in a way gave me hope. Because ultimately, I think we all want to believe we are doing something good for the world. And the dissidence of what that might actually look like, the way we become aware of it in a way that can involve healing and change is gentle communication. And so I have hope that a lot of people, I'm not going to say all, but a lot want to do the right thing and maybe need some advice and learning, and that there's an opportunity for, even as I think about it, the anchoring community, which has a ton of wisdom about like facing your shadow, to have really important dialogue with the people who are arriving about like how to understand that and think about it on a individual and system level.
So yeah, like at the beginning, we did form an advisory board, and we come from a tradition. Like Kyle and I share teachers, and they're on our advisory board. So like I feel wildly accountable to them. So that was really helpful.
Yeah, whenever things would come up, I mean, we're constantly reaching out to, especially Lenny and Elizabeth, but also other people and saying like, hey, like this is coming up. How do we approach this? What do we do? What direction? You know? So yeah, I think that's important to be able to have somebody to do that checking, like checks and balances at times. And you know, when I guess you come from that lineage or community of some sort, right? Like I'm always thinking, well, I'm speaking, you know, kind of for this person in a sense, right? Like I'm holding their image, their teachings with us, and how do I show up with some integrity to move that piece forward without kind of just like throwing it all over the wall, right?
There's a lot of responsibility that comes from public mentorship. There's no question, because you owe it to the people who've taken the time to invest in you to not let them down.
And then what is this anchoring community thing that you've mentioned a few times?
Oh, so yeah, I'm not at all suggesting that this should be the language for anyone else, but at NorthStar specifically, like we look at like a very, very big tent coalition in terms of the psychedelic community or the psychedelic field. I'm not really keen on the word industry because I don't really think it's necessary in a way, but I'm also not keen on community being sufficient to talk about what's happening in the field. Like I think it is a field. And so when I try and delineate a new arrival group, which is simultaneously what I call the Pollanators. So people who like read Pollan's book and are excited, and that's great. And they come in with enthusiasm and they don't know what to do. And then there's people who have had their own experiences and are just kind of on their own timetable showing up. And then there's entrepreneurs and investors who are looking at, you know, natural foods 3.0, cannabis 2.0, and coming in to this space. And so in delineating them as a group, which is structurally gaining a lot of power very quickly, there's the anchoring community, which is quite broad. I used to use the word legacy community. A mentor told me he felt like an old piece of technology getting put out to pasture. And so we are working on using anchoring in that, like, it's really important. The anchor like holds, and the anchor has held. And so the people who've been here, including the elders, including the underground, including the drug policy activists, including the wide coalitions of people. I mean, it's not fully comprehensive. It's not fully delineated. I'm sure there's issues with the word, and it's just an attempt to say people like who I have tremendous respect for, who are defined as having been here and been doing work in this place.
Right. And so back to your piece, Paula, like I think it had a really specific target demographic, right? It's not just the people with money signs in their eyes. They're like, okay, I'm a captain of industry in cannabis now. Let's target this new mega opportunity in psychedelics. Like, the article isn't necessarily for that person. It's for people who had this authentic insight at some point and got really excited about trying to do this thing in a really authentic way. But, they understand there's potholes here and there that we've got to figure out. Like, I've seen a number of really bad situations in the psychedelic world. I'm sure you've heard of plenty. Like, for instance, one gentleman selling 5-MeO DMT and as a sitter, as a, shaman, or however he might phrase it, and then having people smoke 4-ACO DMT, which I didn't even know you could do. And, then not to mention all the rapey and dangerous stuff. Like, Kyle and I have seen some really dangerous stuff go down in the past, and zero accountability, zero, in my opinion, integrity in those situations, like no owning up to responsibility for those people. And then this weird and dangerous thing with like coming off meds, like, let's do this retreat and come off your meds and we'll be there to catch you. No medical people on staff, like perhaps people coming off of meds without guidance and supervision from professionals, which is horrifying. And then loading them up with psychedelics. And you're like, where's the ethics? Like, I don't see that as ethical at all. And this is happening pretty regularly now. And, Kyle and I have been dealing with people coming to us as kind of like the police in the psychedelic space. It doesn't really work like that. Like, I don't have authority or funding, or I don't even know that I have interest in being the police. So like this stuff
I
is
can relate
big.
to that.
And then, what do you do if the people don't want to go public with their story? It's not like if they want to go public with their story, I can do something. If they don't, I can't. And it's like, I don't know.
So
go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, you go for it. I'm all done. I rant too much.
Well, just really quickly, I think it's important to delineate like my own professional sphere, which is really focused on like the shift of the pending phase of commercialization of psychedelics. It's entirely above ground. I think that the underground is extremely complicated, and like always accountability in the prohibition environment is really hard. That's why like organized crime exists in a way, because they build accountability, like they say, silver or lead is how they do it. And so it's really hard, like, because there's no, above ground, you could imagine a TripAdvisor or Yelp, which serves educating people on the caliber of the clinician administering care, or a ZocDoc is a better way to put it, PsychDoc. That would be one way to help hold accountability, check for integrity and ethics. But in the underground, a lot of people don't know where to find someone. And so they often go with the first person they find. And then their hope is they're charging a fair rate. They're going to treat me well. They're going to care about my mental health in the long term. And there's no check. It's extremely difficult to put accountability in that place. So I'm not saying that it's not a massive problem. It is. And I really hope people are working on it. It's just not my critical juncture in terms of my time and energy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There's a lot of big questions there. Like, what does even fair price mean?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
I'm going to help your mental health and perhaps, your whole life tremendously, but I could go to jail, die, or get hepatitis or something. So like, what does a fair price mean? So when I see people critique for high prices in facilitation, especially in the underground, I'm like, well, you're paying for that person to put their freedom and life at risk too. So it's like I guess, I don't know, what's the math? How scared are you of hepatitis in jail? I don't know. Versus like, I don't know. I don't really think people should have faith in the universe. I think they should actually do something to protect themselves too. Like put that money towards a good lawyer, protect themselves from liability issues as much as possible, like buy the best drugs possible, all that kind of stuff. It's a lot of hard math, but thank you for pointing out that's not necessarily your focus.
I'll tell you how I do think about it, because we essentially and I am definitely excited to talk all about NorthStar, but structurally speaking, NorthStar is committed to centering integrity and ethics in the emerging psychedelic field. And when we think about that, it's primarily driven by two forces, which are incentives and pressures. Sometimes people think that NorthStar itself is an entity that has the power to influence. And that's not necessarily true. Like we see with open science and diversity, equity, inclusion statements that essentially the arrival business and finance interests don't have to comply, and there's no consequence for non-compliance. In fact, they don't even have to engage at all with the anchoring community. And there's a lot of negative consequences to that. But anyway, as we think about what we can do to center integrity and ethics, it comes back to incentives and pressures. Incentives are the carrot, pressures are the stick to some extent. Public pressure is a really good one. One of the best things we can think of in terms of building accountability for ethical treatment, for organizational structure, and for pricing is competition of modalities of delivery very broadly. And I'm not exactly sure that's the perfect language, but what I mean is what we could see is a future where decrim and legalization is thriving as initiatives, nonprofit pharma is thriving, and suddenly the only avenue to get psychedelic treatment is not through businesses who have monopolistic control over patient pathways of treatment. And that ecosystem is the healthiest because when you don't have to go one way, there's able to be a flourishing of people doing things the right way and a call to awareness and action about that, which can create pressures for organizations to have more affordable pricing or consider sliding scale or make sure they have a certain degree of clinician training. So anyway, I think it is clearly in companies' interests to not want decrim and legalization to succeed for the sake of bottlenecking monopolistic control. And the ecosystem is most thriving when nonprofit pharma and decrim and legalization are going really well. And so I would just say to anyone who's listening, who's not necessarily interested in the intersection of explicitly business and psychedelics, building that ecosystem serves building integrity and ethics in perhaps the most powerful way. So it's taking that energy and saying, is it volunteering to help the nonprofit pharmas, or is it volunteering to help decrim or legalization initiatives to be done ethically, to have the right DNA in terms of their foundation? But those initiatives also serve to an extent as a check and balance on business as well.
Yeah. Joe and I often talk about these different use contexts. And I mean, when I think about stuff like that, just having one option might not be the best for everybody. And I think having all these different options could be the better way forward, right? I mean, just being able to monopolize off that medical route. And then when you think about I guess the moral aspect of it, it's oh, well, if you're doing this outside of this, you can get arrested and still possibly land yourself in jail. But we're also really interested in helping people, right? And then from that approach, we're not looking at systemic change. We're just looking at, I think, just putting Band-Aids on wounds and saying, all right, well, you can go back out there, but you got to come back here, and every time that wound opened up, you have to come back here instead of going, well, how do we treat this a little bit differently? So when you go back out there, you're more resilient and these systems aren't going to funnel you right back into this.
Yeah.
And I don't know. I think it's going to be an interesting challenge moving ahead. Just hearing critiques on a lot of different fronts about, the medicalization, decriminalization. And I think as people in this field or have an interest in psychedelics and business, really trying to understand all these different use contexts and being able to respect it in some way, right?
Yeah, totally. There was some minor controversy around, I think it was Mindmed. I'm sorry, I'm not going to remember the name, but someone said I don't support legalization or decrim in any way. And if it was Mindmed, it's the same organization. And I think Kyle, we touched on this very.
Yes, Kevin O'Leary.
What was the name again?
That was Kevin O'Leary from Shark Tank at Mindmed.
Okay. All right, great. So thank you for that. And I'm sorry, I didn't know the name. So Kevin says that statement, and Mindmed, Kyle, I think we talked about this last time we chatted, but they have, I believe, a new patent they just bought, which is a medicine which can stop an LSD experience. And so there's a good and bad side to that in the way that I look at it. The good side is that could be really valuable because we know that like really, really bad experiences that kind of go off the rails, like having like a Narcan for those could be effective. Mm-hmm. And there's another thing I see likely in the way that that company uses that patent, which is to say to the field, or rather to the consumer, if the clinician you're working with doesn't have the ability to stop a trip if it starts to get bad, don't go with them, which feeds like the desire to have a one pill solution for people and to have an easy experience. But we know that the therapy is in facing the hard thing, going in and through. And so the company is structurally positioned to tell a message to people that involves saying, essentially, it's a scare tactic that says avoid doing the hard work and only trust our proprietary formula that can stop it. To me, that isn't what they're doing. I'm not accusing them of doing them, but I could see that being part of the strategy that says we are differentiated because we can tell a message that is, if you can't stop a bad trip, the second it gets hard, don't do it. Don't trust that provider. And that's bad for clinical care across the entire ecosystem. So that's just an example of an organization that may be structurally set up to do something that's really harmful in the long term for the sake of short-term profit. I look at that at NorthStar and say, okay, what can we do about it? That's fundamentally the question. It's clear that that's a possibility, and there are like no clear levers of power to create any kind of change behaviorally in that organization that doesn't begin with inviting them into dialogue and building bridges. And that might not be the most appealing work. You might have to hold your nose when you do that, depending on where you're coming from. But that's kind of how I look at it, is that company is structurally positioned to do something that could hurt the field. And in order to work on that, it starts with building bridges.
So it's not about rifles, because you can't really do anything legally, right? Like to force that other than through relationship and, violence. So there's people out there that would go for violence. And the trick is corporations are very resilient. And they can slap in a brand new Stanford, Harvard MBA, no problem. Somebody with 20 years pharma experience, no problem. Like so you're not really going to have an impact. Like it might have a 6-month splash, but it's not really going to help. So that's not the way forward.
I had an interesting experience working as I kind of rose up in the ranks of natural food, of realizing that every person at every level of every company was replaceable. Yeah. Like they are cogs serving a machine that no individual agent can control, which is kind of an extraordinarily destabilizing thing to think about. I have 2 quick book recommendations. One is very related to what you just said, and one is related to what I just said. With what I just said, I really recommend to the centrist people or people in the business community that they read an old book. It's over 100 years old, called The Jungle. Excepting one extraordinarily racist page of that book, it is a masterpiece that helps people understand systemic issues and structural issues around inequality, where it does not matter what people's brains, heart, intention, and work ethic are. The system is going to turn them down and spit them out. And that is not true to the extreme degree that book shows, but is very true today. And what that dynamic is of like individuals being replaceable once the organization's structure is set up that way repeats that. To the activist community, I really recommend Nixonland, which is a really powerful book, which is about the rise of the culture war in the 60s. And you have this phenomenon where LBJ is elected with in 64 with 76% of the vote or something like that. And then 4 years later, Nixon is elected with 76% of the vote. So you have a 4-year period where you swing as a culture, as a society, as an electorate, what is that, 60 points? They go back and forth. And that's just unbelievable when you think about it. And so that happens functionally because of racism, but it comes from exploiting the counterculture's pushing, right? It's the counterculture saying, we know that we see the truth. And so we feel entitled to raise the truth in a way that can be very abrasive. And that leads to a backlash, which not only puts Nixon in the White House, but it puts Reagan in the White House, and it puts Bush and then Bush in the White House. And that culture war, you could argue, contributes to the reason Trump is the president today. And that history is our history. Psychedelic history is that history. So it's just really helpful to see how language, even if it's true, when it's used in certain ways, can lead to highly negative consequences for the advancement of the cause that language was behind. Anyway, recommend it. Put no value judgment on any of the sides in it, but I think it's incredibly insightful, and it helps me kind of in my own evolution from being an activist in my mind to an advocate, and trying to like use language that is a little bit more gentle in service of building dialogue. I think that was my turn to rant, Joe.
Kyle, you're up.
Yeah, a lot of things going on in my head right now. Something that came up, I guess, thinking about this trip stopper and being able to see the benefit of where that could be utilized. But I'm also thinking about consumer education and really educating the consumer. And something that came up was like, I think an example of this in the legal area right now is with ketamine, right? So there's so many options right now for ketamine. And I've talked to plenty of people that have just been to IV clinics and didn't have any of the psychotherapy aspect. And some people really just talk highly of that. I mean, there's lots of people getting involved, nurse practitioners, anesthesiologists are just setting up clinics and doing that work. And not to criticize that, if you're listening and you do that, I mean, that's fine. But, there's people that don't know that there could be another model out there with like ketamine assisted psychotherapy. And I wonder how this could just come back to educating the consumer, and how does the consumer then shape the market? Being like, well, yeah, I guess having a trip stopper could be good, but that's not the whole reason why I'm trying to do this therapy. I'm trying to do this to work on some really deep stuff because I know that this inner process is why I'm trying to engage in it, versus like, oh, you just come here and take the medicine, and then if it gets too hard, we'll just stop it. So I don't know. I wonder how we could make change on the consumer end that would, then shape businesses. And I don't know. I think about that with everything, right? I mean, for example, like Amazon, right? Everybody complains about Amazon. Really great, to be able to just order anything offline. But I mean, also, what if you stop buying from them? Would they start to have as much power as they do if the consumer decided to pull back from that?
The place my head went right away is this phenomenon where you can't effectively protest social media, because if you don't use social media, you become invisible. So your protest, it still looks like everyone's on social media and your voice is just gone. And so in some ways, like that's true for like stopping Amazon as well. And it's basically about like, how do you effectively shape a narrative around change? And I think that's a really hard question to answer. I think it's one that's really important to think about. But the phenomenon we're seeing in psychedelics is that fundamentally, it is the moneyed interests who are coming with capital and also marketing skills who are going to be telling the story of psychedelics to the vast majority of the human public. And that means that for me, that's hard. Like that hurts, because I know from my relationships with the Anchoring community that the wisdom is there. So you really want the wisdom to pollinate the company's approach who's coming. There has to be a bridge there where the companies can say, we have critical skills. The ability to scale access is an extremely important one. The ability to tell stories that make people make decisions. I mean about like understanding informed access and that kind of thing. There's really important skills there. And there's really critical knowledge that the Anchoring community is holding that is structurally right now, it may end up being left out. And I thought about this morning as I was kind of preparing to talk to you both. I think the Anchoring community is losing power, and I think it's losing power exponentially. And today, the Anchoring community has more ability to say to these organizations, let's be in dialogue about how you can do this right, than they will tomorrow. and the next day and the next day, because the curve that is coming in is more capital and more organizations and more people, hopefully well-intended, but maybe just seeing a quick opportunity to make money, who are ultimately going to control the narrative. So it's like, as hard as it is to be someone who has the prayer for these medicines that they change the world, and a world that has been made so unequal and so hurt by capitalism, that now to see capitalism coming for this thing is a lot of pain and wounding that's involved in that. And it is the moment to come into dialogue and say, there is wisdom and learning here that has been here for 50, 100 millennia, like literally thousands of years. And that wisdom can inform how these companies do their work. And maybe it means a 3-degree shift. Maybe it means a 60-degree shift. I certainly know that my time in the field has been its own psychedelic experience. Like, I am a fundamentally different person because of who I've been able to work alongside of in this field and what I've been able to learn from them. And I just wish that DNA was woven into the fabric of every organization that's coming to scale psychedelic medicine. And the only way I can think of to do that is engagement, as hard as that is, which is that means a culture not of calling out, but calling in. And that can be incredibly hard when there's pain associated with it, pain of past traumas and pain of seeing this incredible perpetuator of white supremacy and patriarchy and inequality and racism and ultimately trauma coming here. It's like this grinding thing that's just like coming in and tearing up the land. And like, we have to walk towards that thing, which is terrifying and feels like unfair and evil and yet it is in walking into that dialogue that we can create the change that will make this thing ultimately serve the medicines and serve the planet better.
So I think there's certain individuals at these companies that probably are willing to hear it, right? But there's other people who are just like, shut up, I'm here to make money. Like, I'm a pharma guy. Like, I don't really care and I don't have to listen to you. So I'm going to keep charging forward with my FDA trials and, regulators and lobbyists and all that. But there are folks that might listen. Like, I don't know enough about JR at Mindmed, but Kyle and JR at Mindmed, the CEO, had a little bit of dialogue, and it sounded like he was at least interested in discussing. But I don't know about Kevin O'Leary. And so another big name, George Goldsmith from Compass, like his persona on stage, at least at Horizons this last year, like he seemed like he might be willing to have those conversations. There's some people that say he's backstabbed. I don't really know how to feel about that. Just moving from a nonprofit to a for-profit, for instance, was the primary backstab.
It definitely raises a red flag for sure.
So, there are CEOs out there that are willing to listen, but there's big investors like, just, because I'll probably never talk to him, Kevin O'Leary. Like he's like a hyper capitalist. Like that's his jam. So does he necessarily care? Like their primary thing is it legal and is there consumer demand and can I make money? And that's it. Like, so it's going to be a really interesting thing. And I hope people do that. Kyle and I are trying to do something similar by putting out this media, but we don't necessarily have the funds to go fly to DC or Miami to meet with these people and have these conversations. So I hope folks are, but I don't know who that's going to be. Like Rick doesn't have enough time. Like, are you hoping to fund these kind of missionary trips with your fund? Are you in fund? Or like, what do you see there?
So let me circle back to that question and delineate. Oren is a very small staff. It does like 5 to 10K grants, like a few a year, to mostly like POC people working on equity and access in psychedelics. So Oren, this is a conversation for later about like the intention behind taking my name, not having my name on the story, but we'll circle back to that. So that's what the critical issue you're describing in terms of who has the time for engagement is really important. And then I think there's also this critical question of like, what can be done? And I'm not actually sure it's nothing, because fundamentally, like even just thinking about the field, it's a very precarious legal situation. Like if I'm an investor and I'm looking at psychedelics, I'm like, we are one high publicity disaster away from possibly seeing all of this stop, which means all of the money stopping. It is a risky investment, and it's hyped up like it's a fail-safe way to make billions. And it's not entirely clear. In fact, that single fact that the field is precarious actually puts incentive behind people acting ethically. Like there's more reason to want to see ethical action, not in all ways, like not for IP strategy, but certainly for patient care, because there is such a low margin for error in the field. So that's one that I think is important. Then there's like, how does power get concentrated? So the competition thing is really important. Like you may run a for-profit drug development company, like let's just take Compass and Usona. It is great for the field that Usona is flourishing because Usona is a nonprofit fundamentally committed to having high quality and accessible psilocybin for clinical treatment. That means that they are a price check on Compass. Compass is structurally incentivized to comply with at least a range of pricing because they have competition, which is fundamentally intrinsically committed to human well-being or more than it is the bottom line. So that's really good that that's out there. And anyone who wants to see that increase, like I don't know what exactly the opportunities are, but helping to volunteer or contribute skills to those organizations is really important. And then there's also a lot of other elements. Like it may be the case that there are CEOs or investors who truly do not care about psychedelics or like changing the world or whatever part that we may talk about. I would wonder like if those people have their own experiences with the medicine. I think there's an avenue to do that in a way that is legal and safe and above ground, where people engage with the people who are in those positions and say, let's share this experience and see like kind of how that means to you. But there's also the subordinates at those organizations. Like we've seen the power of employee agency creating catalytic change. And I think Kyle, we were chatting about this last week when we talked, but I think it was Google that was in the running for a defense contract. I'm really sorry, I might be getting this wrong, but the gist is clear, right? This company, a big tech company, was in the running for a defense contract. Something like 600 employees protested. They have like 100,000. It was an incredibly small percent of their workforce, and they pulled out of the contract. So employees have a lot of power, actually, and the public has power, and to an extent, the community has power. And then there's also the distributed ecosystem of care. So a drug developer, many of them are relying on independent clinics to sell their goods. And if I was a company in that position, it would be great to have independent clinics and I can pick them off one at a time. And if those clinics had a concentrated voice, think of like a union of clinics, then suddenly they can price negotiate and they can say, actually, we don't need to use this psilocybin, we can use that one, or we don't even need to do that treatment, we can do this one, or we'd love to have you here. We're so grateful for what you've made. It's a technology, it's a drug, it doesn't matter. And to do that and access all of these clinics, there's some compliance, right? And that includes like maybe the diversity and equity and inclusion on your board or your leadership team, or it includes other dynamics. So at NorthStar, we literally like sitting there staring at the wall and being like, what ways do you build power to incentivize or pressure ethical action across the ecosystem at large? Really big questions and no crystal clear answers at all, but definitely enough direction to be encouraging for sure.
I've proposed this idea on a semi-intermittent basis to various people of I'm happy to use the term industry association. So like lobbyists hired by this industry association could protect their interests, and it could be, a bunch of these small scale clinics feed into that somehow to protect their interests. And it's not very hard. There's other industries that have done this, just if you want to go really basic, you just look at the fair trade stuff for coffee. Like that's an okay step in the right direction. It's a first step. It's not perfect, but at least there's models out there that we can mimic that make it better than it was before or could be in a few years.
I would just say that
Sure.
I disagree slightly with the framing because I think it's very complicated. Like we definitely been looking at it a lot. A lot of people, some of the feedback around the pledge itself is this should be prescriptive. Like there's no teeth, and prescriptive inherently means some kind of power or governance in terms of accountability and auditing. And because, like, if you think about fair trade, primarily the signal of that is to consumers, and consumers have to be educated to say there's all these supply chain issues and inequity is a huge part of them and oppression. And if you care, buy the things that have this seal. And so there's a subset, but it's a little different because they're patients. So they may be like more, in a way, desperate for like good clinical care and have a little less negotiating leverage. But patients could be reached and it says, look for the seal. But it's a multi-stakeholder initiative and coalition with so many organizations selling or serving different things to different entities. And so it actually gets really complicated to like, you have to kind of like audit like clinicians in one place and drug developers and whatever insurers might look like. And it gets very messy very quickly. And so I definitely think there could be value in it. And certainly consumer education is extremely important. It's just, it's hard. Yeah. That's one of the fundamental learnings for us.
So my proposal, and I appreciate the work you're doing. People have to take attempts at this and really put in effort. So my kind of angle is that, is this really the place where therapists should be putting their attention, as opposed to figuring out how to hire professionals that are ethicists who have experience in the medical field, who perhaps have built coalitions before and employ them full time to work on this, as opposed to doing it as a part-time volunteer project. If you've got 5, lawyers in a room, you're probably going to make some headway after a few weeks at least, which is not cheap. But if people come together and form this lobby, like you guys are doing it kind of on the cheap. Like this is not a super well-funded organization that you're with. And I think a lot of folks need to understand that a lot of the shit happening in psychedelics is happening by very underpaid people. And often they're not getting paid at all for these big projects. So like, thank you for doing what you're doing. Like we need these attempts. So my point is, if people came together and said, hey, we need this industry association to protect us from these big people and help steer us in a clear ethical direction, and you had full-time employees working on it for a year or two, like I guarantee awesome progress could be made. So that's kind of my counterpoint. Like and it would be a voluntary thing, a la like anarcho-syndicalism. Like you join the thing and there's no real penalty for not being a part of it, but you're not part of the thing and you don't get any of the benefits of being in the thing. So it's kind of like a voluntary like a voluntarily joinable government in a way that you contribute to. So at the same time it serves you, it doesn't necessarily, you can always leave. So like, I don't necessarily, like your other point about it being prescriptive, it's hard. Like there's a big delineation here between Western and traditional practice, like this kind of tradition that started with LSD and then the tradition that's been around everywhere else for a long time. Like, I don't feel like it's okay at all for us, gringos to be prescribing things to, people who have been using this stuff for many thousands of years, or even, the new Native American church thing, which is really less than 100 years old, I think. Like, it's not really okay for us to even prescribe to them, like, even though they're somewhat new. So it's a wildly complex topic, but I feel like a voluntary Western organization could do really well there. But it takes will. There's a lot that goes into that to, slash and rant.
Thanks for everything you just said. And I think it's fascinating. And I think first I'd like to clarify that NorthStar is not NorthStar. We are not an industry association. However, that language is out there about us. And the reason for that is because really it has to do with the evolution of an organization and timing. So we had the opportunity to write a MAPS Bulletin article about the critical juncture of business and psychedelics, and especially like some of the alternative economic models that could go into kind of mitigating integrity and ethics risks in the way you structure your organization. And at that time, we were floating around language of saying, is it possible to be a multi-stakeholder trade association for the field? And ultimately, we remain unsure about that point. And so unfortunately, because of that opportunity to put that article out there, some people are seeing that language and associating it with NorthStar. It's very understandable because it's our words. And it just was like clearing the publication deadline was several months before where our thinking was at that point. So as a very small and evolving organization, I completely understand that perception, but it's also not specifically the work we're doing. It's more of a project. It's an initiative And it says across this wide,
Right.
diverse field with so many actors and so many different stakeholder groups, what does it look like to make at the intersection of the streets, business and psychedelics, every sign say integrity and ethics, right? To center it in the conversation. And I'll give you a couple early data points on the pledge that are really encouraging. And I can talk, of course, about the pledge process and why we made the decision to be participatory and not prescriptive with it. And one of the early things that has happened is several of the impact-oriented investors in our network have started taking the pledge to their companies. And these are major organizations in the space and saying, we have signed the pledge. I, as an investor, think that the principles of this are really important and commit to what putting integrity into action in my work looks like. And I want to talk about each one of these points with you. And I'm going to take a step back from this and say, is this going to change the world? Absolutely not. Like critical goal of step number one is not radically transform the space. But I think that it's possible that the conversation at a really in-depth level around integrity and ethics may not have even happened at some of these organizations. Because I certainly know from natural food that the way the investor ecosystem works, integrity and ethics are often not even discussed because you're here to make a product and you're talking about product market fit and your go-to-market strategy. And so for me, the notion that investors are using the pledge as a tool to engage entrepreneurs with hard questions about ethics, including significantly diversity, equity, and inclusion and reciprocity as two fundamental things that is extremely important for these companies to consider. And there is no better messenger for them to take it seriously than their own investors. Because if I say it, if you say it, if any of the activists say it, it could just be more mud that's being slung. But this is coming from the people who have structural power within the organization. And they're saying, how are you thinking about diversity, equity, and inclusion? Is your company fundamentally representative enough? Is power distributed enough in terms of stakeholder groups? Is there a medical supervisor on the board? What does reciprocity look like? Like you're making psilocybin that is held in an indigenous tradition for thousands of years. How are you thinking about that? I'm not saying that that's even necessarily going to lead to fundamental change in action, but I think it's really important dialogue. And so it gives me optimism and hope to see those conversations being engaged in that way.
Yeah, great. Thanks for that. I wasn't suggesting that you were a trade association at all. Like right at the beginning, you said you weren't, but
I would understand if you were, though, because there's been a couple of pieces of media that have used that language, and I just want to be conscientious about it.
You read the website; it's very clear. This is a pledge. This is nothing more than a pledge, and not necessarily nothing more than a pledge, but this is like a ethics thing, and you've explained really well what it is. And I'm pretty clear on what your intent was, and I definitely appreciate the effort. And that's really great to hear that you're getting some really powerful folks using it. And I'm sure there's a lot more you're seeing on the back end that we aren't privy to. So when I see it, I'm just like, cool. Like, I don't really know what to do with it. Like, I appreciate that people are taking the time to do that, but it's like, we as Psychedelics Today, how do we relate to this? It's an interesting thing. So we didn't really lay out exactly what this thing is. And we're a little over an hour. Do you want to maybe chat very briefly about specifically what the NorthStar Pledge is?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to do that. The first most important thing I'll say about the pledge is that if we were to do it again, we would have taken longer to do it. And the pledge was conducted over a 6-month process, and it did involve engaging over 100 stakeholders in the community. And that ranges from elders to clinicians to impact investors. And our hope was to have more than that in terms of engagement. And then a little thing called COVID-19 started, which was pretty derailing in terms of like a systematic engagement process. And I think we had the Psychedelic Liberty Summit in our mind as a fixed launch date, and it would have served the work of seeing this dialogue around integrity and ethics centered to take longer and to say at that moment, this is really important. Many people think it's really important. If you're interested, come give us feedback on this thing we're working on, and let's keep it moving. So there's some serious learning for the organization. And this is a constant tension in every organization between commitment to process and commitment to results. And we at NorthStar feel this great debt we owe, indebtedness to the anchoring community to be in engagement, and the pressure that comes from knowing that most business interests are just charging ahead and don't care. And so we feel those tensions. And I definitely know internally that the organization did care a ton about process and definitely tried our best and could have done a lot better, and is very open and receptive to any feedback about that. So that's the first thing. The second critical point on the pledge, which would shape people's perspective on it considerably, is this pledge a beginning or an end? And I would say if the pledge is an end, it is an extraordinarily ineffective document because it is participatory, not prescriptive. It demands nothing, and it allows the openness and spaciousness for people to define integrity and ethics however they choose. And so there might be a question that's like, why is it like that? And that absolutely fits into our dialogue. So flashback in terms of the story, we published, Kat and I, we'll call it Paula, the next day. And I would just say during that story, it's kind of funny. I remember writing this line, and it's something like, we will get psychedelic business models. What we need are psychedelic models for business. And I wrote that line, and then I thought, man, sucks for whoever has to figure out what that means. Because it's really complicated when you get into that realm. Like, what is applying psychedelic intelligence or the lessons clarified by the psychedelic experience to business actually look like? The day after we published the story, we met 3 people who were working on that exact issue. And it was a really symbiotic group in terms of stakeholder representation. Kat, who has been in the community for well over 10 years and is a clinician and facilitator, who's incredibly spiritually grounded and deeply committed to social justice. Liana, who's a drug policy activist, also with more than 10 years of experience, who works in development for MAPS. Sherelle, who's a new arrival, POC woman who came via a startup where she was able to scale an app to over 1 million users through Bain and Company. So she has consulting experience, and she kind of had her own come to Jesus moment around using her skills in life to not advance productive means. And then Tim Ching, who's an investor who I had a lot of skepticism about being on a team with an investor, but ultimately is not only an extraordinarily grounded person, but is making no financial investments in psychedelics, is deeply committed to them, and is an essential stakeholder group as well. So we found ourselves with a team led by women, 3 women, 2 POC, and only 1 white man who you happen to be in dialogue with at this moment, and thought, wow, we have solid, not perfect, solid stakeholder representation. We cover like many different bases in terms of whose perspective we can represent, and also who we know in the mycelial network within the community. And we all critically care about this topic. What can we do to make integrity and ethics central to this field that's so important? Ultimately, we started out on this process of building a pledge and went prescriptive right away. We were like, this could be all these things we want people to say. And then we had on our team one of the co-authors of the diversity, equity, and inclusion statement, Anchakruna, and she was like, you know what? Like, we see this pattern with these statements where you engage all the stakeholders who already resonate with that topic, and the rest of people never see it, never touch it, never engage at all. Which means that as tempting as it is to put something out that says like, these are our values and like, this is what psychedelic business should be, we not only feel like we're not entitled to do that in a way, but that it wouldn't serve the goal of building the dialogue we want. So what we realized is, as a very, very first preliminary step, if we can engage our stakeholders to come up with some fundamental principles to the psychedelic field and say, let's use these as a place for dialogue, it serves centering this conversation in a way that's approachable. Ultimately, we put the pledge through 4 drafts, and I'll let you guys in on a little bit of what that looked like. The first version of the pledge was very left-leaning, without question, probably representative of most of our group's political affiliations and positioning. And early on in the drafting process, like, we were getting a lot of positive reception from the people you'd expect, and a lot of negative or disengagement from the people we also needed to engage, specifically the business community, investor community, new arrivals. We had a version of the pledge. It was the second draft where we had feedback from someone who said, this is a white colonial document written by white people for white people. And we said, okay, great feedback. Really glad we have it. The same version of the pledge got feedback from someone that said, this is liberal claptrap and I wouldn't wipe my ass with it. And we're talking about the same words, which is just so extraordinary. And it goes back to this culture war phenomenon where people are living in universes that are governed by different language. And it is so hard to bridge that gap. Ultimately, what we decided was it had to be a version that was approachable from every direction. The unfortunate part is that one of the reasons it has to be like that is actually because of white fragility. It's because white people have a really hard time looking at words like racism, looking at words like systemic oppression. Am I saying all white people? Of course not. But in the interest of creating critical engagement in a field that has so many people in the business community, so many people who are libertarian in perspective, and so many white people fundamentally who would not engage with this thing with the language that you might expect to see from social justice activists, we put it straight down the center. And that means it doesn't do a good enough job addressing systemic issues. And that's the unfair part. You have systemic inequality perpetuated in a document that doesn't serve the explaining of those people's perspectives because the people who are structurally empowered can't hear it. That's really challenging. That's a brutal place to be in life. And I think it's a place that is so familiar to people that it can lead to a sense of wounding and pain. And I think that those are valid feelings. And we are seeing the engagement with the version of the pledge we have created that we want to see, which is really powerful. We're seeing people say, wow, integrity and ethics are important here. And as fundamental as that seems like as an achievement, that is exactly the point of what Pledge version 1 should look like. And we're in critical conversations with lots of people. People have constructive criticism. They have feedback on how the process could be better. They have directions for the pledge or future. And these are incredibly rich. And we invite feedback at places all over our website. And we also have recurring town hall events. We've just had our first one. We're going to be scheduling our second really soon. So we try and be incredibly open to hearing feedback and model the behavior we'd like the companies we're trying to work with to do as well, which is to be in process with all of your different stakeholder groups and not be arrogant and say that we unequivocally got this right. There's no question. There's no question the pledge process could have been better. It could have been longer. It could have been more comprehensive. We could have engaged more people. And ultimately, unfortunately, given the dynamic where people had a hard time engaging with it as it took on social justice issues, it would have been hard with this first version of the pledge for it to be significantly different from what it was. And we believe what's out there is a tool approachable from all directions to have these critical conversations. And so in that way, it is serving its intention as being a starting point to dialogue.
Which I think it has. There's been a lot of talk about it. People have been like, you've been getting a lot of feedback. I've been seeing a lot of different critiques about it. And I think it is trying to start that dialogue. So I think it worked on that end, right? And we're here to talk about it today. So yeah.
I would love to just bounce one thing to the audience while I have the platform. And I'm so grateful to you guys for building the platform and for engaging in these conversations. The feedback is always valid and we are always open to it. And an important part of it is, okay, so what? So what can we do? Because ultimately, this is not about the pledge. It's about centering integrity and ethics. And critical to that conversation is this notion of incentives and pressures. Because NorthStar is not the companies arriving in the psychedelic field. We are a very small nonprofit committed to seeing integrity centered here. But we don't have the ability to go to those orgs and say, you have to change. We are not representative of them, although we are trying to build the symbiotic relationships with them. So fundamentally, the question the field can be considering is how do we center integrity and ethics in this field? And how do I get the perspectives that I think are critically important raised here? One way to do it is to make it so that intersection of business and psychedelics says, integrity is important here, which means every single person has power they can step into as culture shapers by sharing their own perspective on integrity and ethics. It could be what the pledge is missing. It could also be what's really important to them. What do they wish the new arrivals heard? What do they wish businesses thought about? What education can they give? What learning have they had here? So that dialogue, if raised from stakeholders across the field, will do a lot to make it clearly centered in this space and create that process of saying, everyone appears to be talking about integrity and ethics here. Maybe we should do a little bit of engagement ourselves. That's just a starting point. And from there, it says, how does any organization, or broadly speaking, the people in the field who care about this, see integrity and ethics actually manifest in ways that reach the organization down to their DNA and shape the way that they will scale psychedelic medicine? Because ultimately, this is the critical window. We have a handful of years before these medicines are likely to be prescribable and before scale takes off in a way in which it will be very hard to implement. So we have a critical window to shape the direction. It's not easy. There's a lot of capital and a lot of power that is structurally arrayed against it, but it's an amazing opportunity. It's an opportunity to set this thing off from the right direction. And the thing that NorthStar will never be able to do sufficiently is generate all the approaches that actually might look like. So even Joe, your point earlier about this, the 5 lawyers in the room, if that's a critical approach that appeals to you, by all means, the field needs it. The field needs everyone to step into their power to shape it towards integrity and ethics, which means serving that conversation in whatever means makes sense for each person.
Well, if I only had millions of dollars, what could we do? Yeah. And that's, this balancing act, right? If we had the money, we could make so much of an impact by organizing an organization to do that. But because I've got ethics, I don't have money.
Well, I mean, this is a question I keep coming back to is like, I know capitalism continues to influence systemic issues. And, there's a lot of issues, I guess, with capitalism in general, but also as people that are wanting to get involved they really embody psychedelics, they push against it as well. And I was talking to somebody and they said they were in a small little business community, and a bunch of those actors didn't really follow that business capitalistic route, and they stayed small and just tried to do whatever they wanted to do. And ultimately, the people came in and took over and dominated and shaped the narrative. And I wonder, what is our relationship to money in the psychedelic world? And how do we, I guess, figure out how to move forward and think about a psychedelic business model where we can embody that and move forward and create something that could compete with traditional kind of capitalistic ways of building businesses instead of pushing against it and, like you said, trying to disengage from it, right? That doesn't always work. Like the social media thing. Oh, well, if I just don't engage in it, then I'm making a difference. But at the same time, those people that are on there are louder and have more of a voice to get out there. Yeah. And it's this idea of participation. And, I always think about really smart people that have ethics, that have integrity, also don't end up playing in the game when, if they did a little bit to some extent, how could they shape things and shift things, right? And it's a hard balance, right? Because it goes against a lot of, say, our ethics or our morals at times. But how could we, embody that psychedelic wisdom to be able to create a new model to, maybe compete with that traditional way, but help to change it over times. And I think, as we've chatted about before, of what can we do with this ethics? Is it a prescriptive thing that we got to send out to people that are entering the scene? Or is it part of our due diligence to try to reach out to these companies to develop relationships instead of just saying, I don't want to engage with them because they're taking over, right? And then how does that look on our end where we're not confronting that and saying, hey, you actually reached out to us and we just totally ignored you because we just didn't want to associate with you, instead of actually trying to engage in some sort of dialogue and being like, well, I kind of want to understand what you're doing. Because I think a lot of people are really resistant to that, being like, oh, this person's coming in, we don't want to associate with it. But instead trying to actually build a relationship. And again, then it comes back to time and priorities. Is your priorities there to want to forge that relationship? Maybe, maybe not. But I mean, all things to consider moving forward, I think.
We just don't have time for everything.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, it's true. It's absolutely true. It's so funny. There's a lot of ways to take it, but one reflection from what you're saying is that everyone's on their own journey.
Yeah.
And the way that I am in the world today is very different from the way I was even when I was coming out of natural food. And partly it's because the people around me have really positively influenced me. But the counterpoint to that is that when I was in natural food, my own priorities shifted and they started to represent more and more the priorities of the people who were influencing me. So my world became smaller and my goals became goals in relative terms to the field itself. Maybe having my own natural food brand, maybe getting my own, and so ultimately almost the best thing that the field could do is to welcome these people in and say, like, there's some intrinsic magic here. And it'd be great for you to get to know it. In fact, it really might serve you. And hey, you have skills that would serve it as well. And so, yeah, that dialogue is really hard to build, but it's critically important. So to the question of competing, there's a really interesting thing that I have a theory. I'm not sure if it's going to play out as true, but I think to an extent, the most transparent business model for psychedelics will be the most competitive because you're treating people's consciousness. So it's an unprecedented level of trust. It's like an open heart surgeon or a brain surgeon, a rocket scientist, and like a psychedelic clinic. Like there's only a handful of fields where like trust is so critically important. And in that way, if you're a business and you can like expose your model and say, we have these investors, but they have a capped return, let's say, and we're structured to like seed equity to a stakeholder group of patients over time or whatever structure it looks like. And you can say all those things and you can be crystal clear and transparent. And the other company who's like essentially fundamentally profit maximizing by virtue of their position in the field and their fiduciary responsibility can't say any of those things because their job is to like extract as much as possible and return it to investors. Fundamentally, you have a huge competitive advantage. One way that I think about it is this idea of patient-focused patient capital. So a way that capital can be deployed into this space is to pool resources that don't need venture returns, but can fund the building of these independent clinics that are going to be a primary delivery mechanism for psychedelics, help them get off the ground. And there's a really good like example or a foil for this that's going on in sustainable ag. There's a company called Steward, and they essentially they pool resources and they fund independent sustainable ag farmers to get their farm going and then help provide the technological infrastructure to let them run their business really effectively. When those farms are flourishing, they return essentially the startup capital back at a percentage of profit. So the fundamental goal of that organization is to see the farms thrive. Like they are structurally set up to say the number one thing we can do in the services we create and in the capital we give is see this thing itself succeed. That structure would apply very well to the building of psychedelic clinics. Like it's not clear that those have to be a venture-backed model. There are places venture capital might be really helpful in psychedelics. There's lots of places where it's a really important question to say, is venture capital, which means a mandate for rapid scale and a mandate to have an exit or an IPO or sale, does that really apply here? Like my colleague, Sherelle, who's absolutely extraordinary and has coined the term visionary operator, or bringing like the highly effective component of business to the heart-led organizations, talks about psychedelics as part of the infrastructure required to put these psychedelics treatments across the country at minimum, but really the world, is kind of like scaling dentistry. It's kind of like we need like dentists everywhere. What we need are like places for the dentist to be and like really good training for the dentist. And we don't need like fancy toothpaste yet. Like we don't need like the super custom blends of this and that, or like the AI powered, like we don't need anything like that. We have really great medicines that produce incredible mental health outcomes, and we need the infrastructure. Dentistry is not a venture-backed business. Dentistry is mostly like independent people who have a fundamental skill who can administer that skill. So I think there's a lot of ways that both trust plays into this and transparency, and then fundamentally psychedelic models for business, like really cool ways that we can structure deploying capital in service of providing access and ideally structurally empowering not only the clinicians, but the people they treat and the communities that they are treating as well. So there's interesting things. And then the last thing I'll say is that a mentor of mine, one day, a few months ago, when I was riffing away on capitalism, she's a POC woman, really amazing inspiration. And I was riffing away on how evil capitalism could be. And she said, "Are you sure capitalism is intrinsically bad? Could you imagine capitalism looking like it did today if the companies were run by women and people of color?" And I was like, people who are aware structurally of what it's like to not have power will not hold power in the same way as the people who structurally have never known that. And I don't think that capitalism would be the same if it looked like that. There's this fascinating element to like, it's not necessarily just capitalism. It is definitely about the system having structurally privileged some people and those people holding power, right? I mean, even right now, like I'm cognizant, and we have to name that we're three white men on a platform having a conversation about psychedelics. And I know you guys care about this, and I know you think about it. It's just so critical to voice that like power, one primary way white people can engage with power, white men especially, is to help use their position in power to raise up marginalized voices and women. I'm super proud to work at a women-led company that has 2 of 5 members POC. Is it perfect yet? Not at all, but it's a great critical direction. And to get to something we talked about earlier, I decided in terms of my education in the psychedelic field that I didn't want to be a public figure in any capacity, because I was like, I don't need to be another white man taking a microphone. I want to raise other people up. And in terms of any advice I've ever given or counseling, I've only done that with women in POC who I admire tremendously in this space. But what happens is, if you don't tell your own story, people start to fill in the gaps for you. So my effort to say, it's not about me, I'm just going to put out these things, leads to, understandably, of course, like suspicion or people wanting to know, like, who is this person? So I think it's really important to have conversations like we're having. It's also really important to say, we as white people, young white men in psychedelics, structurally privileged, the world literally rolling out in front of us, have such a tremendous opportunity to use our power to raise up women and people of color and to give them power. And it's not a zero-sum game. It's just like, there's this extraordinary thing where we can be in service to that, and it ends up being symbiotic.
Totally. Yeah. Thanks for pointing that out. And, it's definitely something Joe and I have thought about, having this platform on who are we bringing on and wanting to like put voices out there that may not be heard. I mean, for example, I don't even think we've had Rick on yet, right? And sometimes we find people that are doing really interesting work in the psychedelic field and would want to give them a platform because maybe they don't have that to get their voice out there. And so I don't know. Yeah, it's definitely something Joe and I think about often with this platform. So yeah, thanks for highlighting that.
Yeah.
And I think, we could definitely do a better job too with getting more women and people of color on here for sure.
I think I would just say that you guys have an amazing opportunity, because there's this like phenomenon where people are like, oh, like we want women speakers or people of color speakers at our conference, but there just aren't any. And there are, like, I know so many extraordinary women and people of color who are just like crushing it in the psychedelic field. And I look at it and say, you're like, in a way, like you represent the future of leadership in this field. And you guys have this amazing ability to like bring on some of those extraordinary critical voices and allow them to shine. It's an amazing gift that you guys can provide. And they, sometimes people just need to be seen in that one setting. And when they are, someone's like, I remember they made me feel a certain way. And I want to find that person again. And, we can all play our part in helping a generation of leaders who are women and people of color come to shine in this field. And I so look forward to that day. And I tell you, like, that will be a better day for integrity and ethics in the field. And I'm not saying that because it has to structurally disempower white men. It doesn't have to work that way. Like, there's so much to be gained in learning how to support others as a primary form of leadership.
Totally.
And so for me, it's like critical platform to raise those voices.
Well, I think that is like one key element of like an effective leader, is being able to support others and put people in their roles and empower them to step into that and to really shine, right? Instead of like, me, it's all about me, right? It's like, no, like I think part of our job is to be able to put people in those positions and find those people and let them shine, let them step into their power and, take on a role.
Yeah, it's great. I think you guys have a lovely platform for that. And I appreciate both of your listening abilities, because it can be hard dynamically to like, in a way, be talked at. I'm cognizant of it right now. It's a joy for me to share on these critical issues. And at the same time, it takes patience to like let the ideas come out, and you're serving your audience really effectively in doing that.
Thanks. Yeah, maybe it helps on my end of doing therapy and stuff. People just talking at me all the time.
Yeah, therapists for the psychedelic airwaves.
Awesome. Well, we're at time, or well over time. Anything that you want to close with? Anything that you want to plug? Where can people find you, or any last notes here?
I want to plug women and people of color in leadership in the psychedelic field. And I'll start with NorthStar. We have an extraordinary woman who leads this organization, and the power is structurally situated between 3 women. And I come from a field dominated by white men, and have known that in the organizations I've been a part of for most of my life. And it is so much richer to be a part of this organization, to see these people stepping into their own power. It is honestly one of the honors in my life. And I look forward to, in this dialogue around integrity and ethics, a big part of it being who can we structurally empower? And I say structurally empower because by virtue of having it, by virtue of being white men in this society, we can give it away. And that in and of itself is a gift. So that's the last thing I say. And I'll be publishing on that topic in the near future with a specific audience of fellow white men. And we have a lot of our own learning to do, and patriarchy rots from the inside out. Like, there's a reason that diseases of despair disproportionately are impacting white men right now. Like, it is a really brutal dynamic, and there's so much to say about it, but maybe this is just the beginning of that rich conversation. So I will end with pride for all the ways that NorthStar can and will continue to grow and improve and be better. I am so proud to be a part of this organization for who is in charge and the way that they approach their work every single day. And I am so excited for the day that the field is full of companies and nonprofits and organizations and gatherings, and they look like this and they think like this, and they say, we can also get better.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much, Dave. It's been a real pleasure chatting with you. And thanks for just sharing everything that you're doing and the work that you're doing. And for those, maybe you didn't plug your site, but what's the site for NorthStar if people want to check that out?
Yeah, so NorthStar's site is northstar.guide. And we have a Medium page that we'll be putting up with some really critical perspectives in the next few days. And then we are incubated by Oren Project, which is a nonprofit incubator. That's orenproject.org. And that's where We Will Call It Paula is published, and some more content will be going up there as well soon too.
Awesome. Thanks so much. Until next time.
Thank you.
Thanks for what you do. Thank you so much. And I'll talk to you guys later.